عليه وسلموا تسليما صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Shukran, Imam. Bishop, can you please lead us in Christian prayers?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. Gracious and eternal Father, Thou God of truth and love, Thou God of mercy and compassion, Thou God of forgiveness, Thou God who reconciled people with differences, Thou God who forgives our imperfections, our human frailties, and Thou God who is a God of justice. We, the people of the Gambia, surrender ourselves wholly unto You and grant that we will exercise patience, we will exercise love, we will exercise compassionate heart, we will exercise the spirit of reconciliation and the spirit of forgiveness. We also ask that You will grant us the patience to be a people that will respect the rule of law in our land. And as we go through the TRRC, may the truth come out. May hearts be healed. May families be reconciled. This we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Bishop. Council, can you tell us what we have on the table today?
Good morning, Madam Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning to you all. For today's hearing, we have two expert witnesses. We will begin this morning by hearing from Madam Hadim Boj Barrow, who will tell us about sexual violence in the Gambia. And then in the afternoon, we should hear from Dr. Dafe, who will also tell us about sexual and gender-based violence, but more from a medical perspective. So in order to start, I would ask that Madam Hadim Boj be brought in to start her testimony.
Thank you very much, Council.
I, Hadim Boj Barrow, do swear that
I'll speak the truth,
I'll speak the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
So help me God.
So help me Allah.
Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Hadim Boj Barrow. Welcome to the TRRC.
Thank you.
Before we begin, how would you like me to refer to you? Would that be Madam Boj or Madam Barrow?
Hadi.
Well, I would not say Hadi.
Auntie Hadi.
Okay, thank you very much for appearing before the commission. For your testimony today, I would like to tell you a little bit about the rules within the hearing room, just so that you can understand what else is happening. There is interpretation into the local languages, and so I ask that you speak slowly and allow pauses in between your statements to allow for interpretation. If at any point you would like to say something in any of the local languages, particularly Mandinka, Wolof, and even Fuller, our interpreters can interpret that. Because perhaps it might be a bit easier to explain certain things when we talk about culture and its impact. Similarly, I will ask questions, but if at any point my questions are unclear or you would like me to repeat, please feel free to do so. This session will be about an hour and a half, and we will cover 8 topics. Some topics are much shorter than the others. We will begin with background information, just about who you are. Then we will talk about your professional experience and your expertise in sexual and gender-based violence. We will then talk about a few concepts that would be important for us here in the Commission as well as the public to understand when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence. Then we will talk about how sexual and gender-based violence is manifested in the Gambia. So we'll talk about the types of violence that you come across in your work, as well as the patterns of behavior that you've come across. It will also be important for us to understand certain specific terms in local Gambian languages when people are trying to describe sexual violence, because that will help the Commission to identify such issues. Then we will talk about the impact of sexual and gender-based violence. We will then talk about the key factors that contribute to sexual and gender-based violence in the Gambian context. And then we will talk about the complaints mechanisms that are available for people to report cases of sexual and gender-based violence. And we will also talk about the challenges within the Gambia when it comes to addressing sexual and gender-based violence more broadly. And then we will conclude with your recommendations on sexual and gender-based violence, how the Commission can include some of those in our recommendations and consider, for instance, issues such as reparations in relation to sexual and gender-based violence victims. So those are the topics I hope to cover. Is that fine with you?
Yes.
You already know who I am, but I tend to just state it again for the record as a matter of procedure. Hareja Balagay. I will begin by asking you your full name, so please state your full name for the record.
My name is Hadim Boj Baro.
Can you tell us when and where you were born?
I was born on the 25th of December, 1958, at Dankunku, Nyamena Dankunku District, Central River Region.
Can you tell us a little bit about your educational background? When and where did you attend school, as well as the years when you attended, to the extent that you recall?
Yes, I attended Dankunku Primary School, and this was 1964 to 1969, when I sat to the Common Entrance Examination. I sat to the Common Entrance Examination, and that is where I dropped out from school. And yes, I briefly went back to school again in 1972. Again, repeat grade 6, commonly called at that time primary 6, and that was the end of my formal school. However, in 1980, I went to the school for community health nurses, and I graduated as a community health nurse. And after that, of course, I attended numerous trainings, but eventually in 1997, I went to PEDWA, Pan-African Institution for Development, and I graduated a diploma in integrated rural development. I majored in project planning and management. And I also did a diploma in gender and development, and of course other trainings in gender and sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender-based violence, among other numerous trainings.
And in fact, it would be a good time to focus on your professional experience and in particular your expertise on sexual and gender-based violence. Can you tell us about essentially a summary of your career and the type of work that you were doing?
Yeah, my career began in 1974 when I was still very young. Around 17 years, I started working as a nurse attendant in Bansang Hospital, and a career that I did up to 1980 when I went to the School of Community Health Nurse. And upon graduation, I worked as a community health nurse, and very shortly, I was fortunate to go under training for Training Center for Health Service Personnel in Yaba, Lagos, to be trained as a trainer on primary healthcare workers. So I am among those who have pioneered primary healthcare in this country, and I was a trainer for village health workers and traditional birth attendants in the eastern region of the health department at the time, which consists of CRR, URR, and LRR. So after that work for 5 years, I also worked in 1986. I started working with a project called Jahali Pachar Project as a daycare coordinator, which gave me the opportunity to work with communities in CRR, particularly the Sarahule communities in Medina and Jahale. And then that career also, I continued up to 1992 when I worked briefly with Department of Community Development as a homecraft assistant for 1 year, but alongside, I was working as a part-time for Gambia Women Finance Association as extended credit clerk. I continue working with GAUFA as a savings and credit officer. And during that time, I received training on microfinance, entrepreneurship. I was a trainer, and I worked in LRR, part of CRR and URR. And this is a position I hold up to 1999 when I worked for the Gambia Family Planning Association as area manager for LRR and West Coast region. And the position I hold up to 1999. And in 1999, I joined the National AIDS Secretariat as the regional coordinator for KMC and BCC. And that time was the time when I also worked as the coordinator of the Network Against Gender-Based Violence simultaneously. So a position I hold for NAS up to 2017, and then I retired, and eventually 2018 I also retired from the Network Against Gender-Based Violence.
And in fact, I would like to focus specifically on your time at the Gambia Family Planning, National AIDS Secretariat, and then the Network Against Gender-Based Violence. Can you just remind us when you worked at the Gambia Family Planning? Because I'm not sure I have the dates correct.
I started working there January 1999.
And when did you stop working there?
2009 January.
So can you tell us a bit about the type of work that you did as regards sexual and gender-based violence at the Gambia Family Planning?
During my entire career, because I've been working with communities, I've been working with women, I've been working with girls, I came to realize that there have been a lot of issues surrounding women, sex and sexuality, and sexual and reproductive health issues. And as I know, some of the issues, I know them very clearly at the time, but I have not seen much being done at that particular time on issues surrounding that, considering the taboo of talking about sex and sexuality in our communities. And when I started working with the Gambia Family Planning Association, also remembering very well when I was at the age of 10 or 11, when my father was a district chief, he presided over a rape case. This case was had in his veranda. It was not an open court, but I was very young, but I could fully remember a perpetrator was sentenced and sent to Janjambure. And that stick to my mind that this is something very wrong. And since that time, I was thinking about it. And my interaction with women give me the opportunity to know that In fact, this is still happening in the communities. When I started working with Gambia Family Planning Association, Gambia Family Planning is one of the NGOs which works on sexual and reproductive health and rights. In fact, after the Cairo conference, where the shift from stand-alone family planning to sexual and reproductive health and rights, Gambia Family Planning went ahead of the government to start working on sexual and reproductive health and rights. At the time, before the Gambia government even started working on reproductive health, because they didn't put the S there. Government just work on reproductive health and rights, but Gambia Family Planning boldly start working on the issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights, considering that people have reproductive age group, but sexual has a bigger age group. It starts early and it ends very lately. So if you remove the S, you are removing certain part of the society to attain that services. So at that time when I started to work as area manager, working with very competent clinic assistants, I come across a lot of these issues. And that motivated me more. My role at that time was more of coordination and monitoring, but I went further because of my interest. I work like a clinic assistant, and I normally work with, even doctor comes on Trrc, I work with her. And then when I go to the communities, I try to work on these issues until I raise up a drama group in LRR to create awareness on issues of early sex and the complication. So my career on sexual and reproductive health rights began mostly when I started working with GFPA. During that work as an area manager, because of the potential and the innovations I brought to the organization, the director recognized that. I thank him for recognizing that. And I have the opportunity to do my diploma in gender and development at MDI. And immediately I completed that. What I did was to make sure that I pushed for the development of a gender policy at GFPA. And that policy gave us an opportunity to mainstream gender. And that was the time when IPPF, International Planned Parenthood Federation, also was pushing the issue of mainstreaming gender into sexual and reproductive health. I hope I'm not talking fast.
I wanted
That's
to
my
ask,
weakness.
I wanted to ask you to slow down a little bit. The interpreters haven't complained or said anything, but if you could slow down a little bit.
I will try. I will try. I'm so sorry. That's how I am. So actually, when we start mainstreaming sexual and reproductive health rights, then a gender unit was created at GFP. And I remember one of my seniors at the time was heading the gender unit. I was an assistant. By then I was still in LRR and West Coast Region. But eventually, when I was promoted as a program officer and I came over, I head the gender unit. And when I start heading the gender unit, I have a lot of opportunity to be trained further. I was trained on gender-based violence in 2002 in Ethiopia, where issues of gender-based violence in all its forms were discussed at length. And when I came back, I started thinking how we can mainstream the issue of gender-based violence. We were fortunate, we have a project under the core. When GFPA say core, they are talking about funds that come from IPPF. We have a project under the gender, which is gender and sexual and reproductive health, and I headed that project. When I headed that project, I got an opportunity to be trained at CARS, Center for African Studies in Nairobi, on gender and sexual and reproductive health. That training was training for trainers. At the end of the training, I was identified with the director of Ivory Coast, Abidjan, the director of the Family Planning Abidjan, as trainers for other member organizations of the IPPF. So I was handling the English-speaking countries to be training their member organizations on gender and sexual and reproductive health and rights.
Perhaps, Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to say perhaps this would be a good time for you to explain concepts like gender and gender mainstreaming, what they mean, as well as gender-based violence.
When we talk about gender, it's a social construct. It's about relationship. It's about things that you learn. It's about things that can change. It's about men and women. It's about girls and boys. So when we talk about gender, we are not talking about sex, which is biological made. Until now that science is very advanced, those are things that you cannot change. But gender in a simple language is about roles. It's about responsibilities. It's about power dynamics. Those are the simple definition one can give to gender. And the reason why we said it is something that you learn, it's not God-given. You learn them. And it differs from one region to another, from one tribe to another. So gender is about that. It's about the role that people ascribed. Boys should do this. Girls should sweep. They should cook. Women should be submissive. It's people that put it there. It's not God-given. So when we talk about gender, is that when we are talking about gender mainstreaming, we are talking about things that you can enhance. In doing so, you are talking about the relationship, how we can make it better. When we are talking about gender mainstreaming, we are talking about resources, how we can make sure that we put resources in organization. When we are talking about gender mainstreaming, we are talking about how we can change status quo, which is happening in organization. So when we are talking about, you are talking about gender-based violence, we are looking at if gender is about women and men, when it is about things that are given. And we know violence is about hurting or harming somebody. Violence is about that, inflicting pain on somebody. So if you put the two words together, you are trying to define inflicting pain on somebody, whether it is physical, whether it is psychological, whether it is sexual, because of the person's gender, because of the person is a woman, because the person is a girl, because the person is a boy. So when you put it together, you are talking about gender-based violence. So if you are talking about gender, sexual and reproductive health right, you are talking about people's the way sex and sexuality unfold on a particular gender, whether it's a boy or whether it's a girl. You are talking about reproduction, having babies, having children. So those are the kind of definition I can give it from my own perspective. Remember, this is a school dropout. Maybe my English will not be strong, but people here can better understand what I'm trying to say.
We completely understand what you're saying. So in that sense, can you give us examples of gender-based violence within the Gambia? What are some of the types of gender-based violence that you come across generally in the Gambia?
I always tell people in the Gambia, gender-based violence starts immediately when you give birth as a woman. If that baby becomes a baby girl, that's where it starts. Somebody, whether a family, whether a husband, whether a sister-in-law, whether a mother-in-law, wow, why is he bringing a baby girl? Why not a baby boy? It starts right there. So that's a violation of the right of that woman who undergo pregnancy 9 months and go into labor. She should be thanked for giving life. But instead, people are asking, why did you give birth to a baby girl? So for me, that's a violation of the right of that woman and that baby girl right there. And this is what happened in many of our communities from there. As the child grows up, you can vividly see the way we handle issues as the children grow up. We have a baby boy, we have a baby girl. As they grow up, the toys that we go and buy even tell you what we are doing. We will be buying dolls for the baby girl. We will be buying stuff that she can start doing cooking demonstration and things. We are telling her that prepare yourself. You're going to be a mother. You're going to be maybe a baby manufacturing machine. That's what we are putting in her head. While when we go to buy, we buy very fancy cars as toys, airplanes for the boys, and guns. We are telling them, look, you are supposed to work hard to become rich. but you are supposed to be very strong and even violent. That's what we are putting into their head. That continues even at the school level. It's just now the school curriculum change. But otherwise, when you start reading the textbooks, that is what is there. But that change eventually. As we grow up, the way we divide roles in the household are gender-based violence. And then you now talk about FGM. Sometimes as early as the baby is 1 week, the child undergoes FGM. It's a gender-based violence. Child marriage is a gender-based violence. Even preference in education, until when the affirmative measures was taken by the government and the Minister of Education, where education was free for girls. We know that boys are the preference to go to high schools. But even now, I told people, yes, the admission rate is very high, but do we look at the retention rate at the tertiary institution? So all these are gender-based violence. We can go on and on. Physical violence, we can go on and on.
And we'll look at those in more detail when we move on to other issues. But what about when it comes to sexual violence? How would you define it for the layperson? What is sexual violence and what kinds of conduct constitute sexual violence?
Sexual violence is any advance that you do towards somebody and it's not acceptable. The person has not given his or her consent. There is force, and then the person didn't give her consent. In a simple language, that is how I will define sexual violence. And either whether you are touching the sexual organs, and there are many, or whether you have actually sexually violated the person. Sexual harassment, all this can mount to sexual violence. And even words people need to understand can mount to sexual violence. The use of certain words on opposite sex can be sexual violence. The way you touch the person can mount to sexual harassment. So there is quite a number of things the way it is defined.
And from what you've said, some of the things we can get from that is understanding that gender does not only mean women, it's men, women, girls, boys, you can go on. Understanding the types of behavior that constitute gender-based violence, including examples you've given, child marriage, FGM. And then you've also talked about sexual violence, because a lot of people may only think of rape as sexual violence, but from what you've said, obviously goes beyond that. You've told us about what you did at Gambia Family Planning. Perhaps we can also talk about how that fed into your National AIDS Secretariat work and the kind of work that you did in relation to these issues again.
Yeah, while working at the Gambia Family Planning as a program officer, when we started our gender program, that is the time we even started seeing victims or survivors of gender-based violence at Gambia Family Planning Clinic. Actually, my work started there, seeing the victims directly. And then our clinical assistants were trained how to handle these cases. And then myself at the time and the program officer service delivery, Madam Fatoumata Ba at the time, we deal with these cases. So the work started gradually at Gambia Family Planning Association at our clinic. And we used to see survivors of FGM at the Gambia Family Planning Association there with Dr. Kamara. And some who have gone like the type 3 of FGM or type 4, the severe type, are sometimes being managed at the Gambia Family Planning by Dr. Kamara. So we started this work there, and we even piloted what we call the male-only clinic at Gambia Family Planning, considering that when people talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights, people think it's only about women. Of course, it's about men. The male-only clinic gave the opportunity to men who have sexual issues or reproductive issues to come to those clinics. Because, you know, in our culture, when you are married, you don't get a child. Everybody look at the woman, when actually there are men who cannot have a child. They cannot even have it. That's the reality. There are men who have a very low sperm count. They need to get some support for them to have a child. So during the male clinic, those things were picked out and some were really supported. So all that work started at GFPA when I was there. We were doing that work. And in that work, I have another project that I was also handling, which is the HAP, Rapid Response to HIV and AIDS, and the Global Fund Project. And this is mainly working with the area of HIV and AIDS. So I was heading that project and working with my program manager at the time and working directly with PLHIVs. And all this together added up because of the issues I'm seeing. This added up in my career in the work of sexual and gender-based violence to the extent by the time I leave Gambia Family Planning, I have started working on how I can come up with an organization which will be really focused on this. And during that time, Gambia Family Planning have a consortium also that work in this area. I remember the consortium was GFPA, Worldview, and the athlete was there. She can fully attest to that. And we have Trrc, Gambia Red Cross. I cannot remember the other members. And Action Aid International was the one funding this consortium. And my work continue again. All this is in the area of sexual and gender-based violence. So by the time I leave GFPA, I've already started doing a lot of communication, looking for funding behind the scene for 4 years before I can actually really get funding to start this network against gender-based violence.
And did you start working for the network, start the network against gender-based violence before you went to National AIDS Secretariat, or did they happen at the same time?
I can say the organization to actually kick off, yes. I was not yet at NAS because when I started the fundraising by making proposal was 2004. But 2009, when I retired, I was doing a briefly consultancy work for Hanson Care. During that time was the time I set up the network, and then I moved to NAS.
So let's focus on the network against gender-based violence. What actually led you to establish such a network?
Like I said, my career pattern and the passion I have. My career pattern working for women and girls throughout almost 4 decades. When I was setting the network, it was 3 decades. I was working in this area, considering what I'm seeing. I know that a lot of work was being done by government and other NGOs. But what I didn't see clearly is how we can coordinate all these efforts, put them together, and make sure that this survivor or victim is not continuously re-victimized in the process. And also I was thinking something was lacking was the issue of privacy. So this led for me to think about all this expertise in the Gambia, everybody doing a small thing. How can all of us come together and do this better? So that came to my mind, and that led me to think about forming this network.
And so you said the network was established in 2009. Can you tell us what the objectives or the mission of the network against gender-based violence is?
Yeah, the network actually was established in 2009, but the actual work began in 2010. It began when I got a strong promise from the Foreign Affairs Ministry of Finland through a strong lady, Sarah Rukon and Saya Jevin in Finland. And they worked for an NGO in Finland at the time called Ratas, and the meaning is Christian, I think Christian for Peace in English. So they facilitated for us to get funding from the Foreign Affairs Ministry of Finland. And they actually come in person in the Gambia, and we had a meeting with them. And people who matters at that time were invited, like Child Protection Alliance, Women's Bureau, Department of Social Welfare, FLAIR. FLAIR acronym, I cannot actually remember what it means, but it's like something on legal something. So all these people came together, and Department of Social Welfare, we discussed.
Is that FLAIR or flag?
FLAIR is different from flag.
Okay.
Yes, it's different from flag. These are the initial group, and YWCA, sorry. These are the initial group that came together to discuss about the network, and we form it. From there, we kick off. And the most interesting thing is all the initial project management committee of the network who worked with me to make this what it is are all men except myself and Matilda Johnson. So that shows you that, yes, Gambian men, there are very strong men who really feel that the status quo should kill. All of them were men. So when we came together, we look at the objective. But the main objective of the network is to make sure that we eradicate or minimize gender-based violence in our society. And the way we should do this is through advocacy, awareness raising, research, training, capacity building. These were some of the things that we agreed that we are going to use that strategy to make sure that we work. And partnership was something that was very emphasized in what the network want to do.
You talked about capacity building being one of the objectives of the network. Who are some of the professionals, or what kind of professionals was the network trying to train in which sectors of society?
When we conceptualized the network, of course, at that time, I already have at the back of my mind, considering that when I went to Nairobi, working on gender and sexual and reproductive health training, one of the things we do was the field work. There is this Nairobi Women Hospital and Nairobi Women's Lawyers Association. I learned a lot of things there that I carried back at home. So when we were conceptualizing the network, one thing that came out clearly at the beginning is we wanted to have a one-stop center. So that came out clearly in our objectives. So at the time, when we conceptualized the network and know that we want to have the one-stop center, the first thing we did was, let us do a desk review and know what is already happening in the country before we just started doing something. And that desk review clearly tells us that a lot of work is being done in the area of gender and sexual-based violence. But like I said, it was not coordinated. Hospitals were seeing, of course, sexual violence victims, and the doctors and the nurses were attending to them. But every doctor or nurses were attending to them the way they learn from the training schools, like if somebody is raped, what you are supposed to do here and there. They have different approaches. That's what is happening at the hospital. There is no uniform approach towards it. The documentations were not uniform. The way they handle the survivor or victim, they don't have a clue on that. And there was this strong belief that even a victim of sexual violence, when it comes to the hospital, the nurses or doctors will not attend to her until she has a police escort. So that was very strong. That came out. The police also, the way they were handling the sexual violence victims at the time was like any other assault cases. So all that putting together, we realized that there have been a very big gap in terms of coordination and the way things were done. The capacity is inadequate at the police sector, inadequate at the healthcare delivery. It was inadequate at the Department of Social Welfare for the social workers. So putting all that together, what the network did after the desk review was to hire a consultant and develop guidelines and develop standard operational procedures alongside with the guidelines. And these were the guidelines that were used to train trainers. And these are doctors that we brought together to train them. And these are gynecologists and other doctors that are working in this area. and they were trained. And alongside, they also provide step-down training for many doctors and nurses across the country. And then another guideline was developed for psychosocial support. But when we were doing this training, really we received a lot of technical support from Finland. I remember from Finland, we have somebody working in their police department who is dealing with this, who came. They also support in the training area of the police and the social workers. So that is the capacity building we did in that particular service delivery, the police, the social workers, and we call them the clinic workers. Those are the doctors, the nurses, they were all trained. And this training continues up till now. So that is what we did in that area.
So what I understand from you is that you realized that there were many different actors who were working on sexual and gender-based violence, and you thought it was better to have it under one roof, essentially, a one-stop center of different professionals that would work together and essentially coordinate their services to make sure that victims are treated the same way and at the same time without duplicating resources.
Exactly.
Is that correct?
Exactly.
So this team of professionals, you mentioned doctors, you've mentioned counselors, you've also mentioned the police as well. How is this team put together? Because I'm trying to find out if a victim walks into a one-stop center, what can they hope to expect from that one-stop center? What are the services that are provided and by who?
Yeah, I will just touch on the services that are provided at the one-stop center, but I'm reliably informed that somebody from our team, who is a medical doctor, will also testify here. I know he will explain in detail what actually happened at the one-stop center. But understanding very well, the concept note came from us, so I know what is going to happen there. But what happened is that before we even bring these people together, we develop an MOU. And we develop an MOU to set up a one-stop center. And this is one unique example that you may find very rare in many countries, and even including the Gambia, where government and civil society come together to work. That's the network. When we were conceptualizing the one-stop center, when we developed the concept note, we have what we call a roundtable conference. And this roundtable conference, we make sure that the Director of Health Services was represented, and Department of Social Welfare Director, NALA, I think is the National Legal Aid, NALA was there, and the Women's Bureau, Action Aid International, the Gambia, and Child Protection Alliance. The list goes on. I will apologize for those organizations. I cannot just remember offhand. If I refer to my document, maybe I will know all of them. So what we did, we developed an MOU. When we develop an MOU, we make sure that every head of institution sign this MOU and agree that this is going to be their responsibility in the operationalization of the one-stop center. Like the Inspector General of Police signed to say that this will be the role of the police, like the police will make sure that they do the arrest, they do the investigation, and they prepare the prosecutions. And the justice were part of it, and the Justice Department, like the police, after they have received the file, they send it to the Justice Department for review and advice, and they will also take their role as Justice Department. NALA, of course, we know that they provide legal aid for capital cases, not other gender-based violence issues. They also, their role is clearly spelled out. Women's Bureau, their coordination role. Child Protection Alliance, being a specialist in children issues, also their role is clearly spelled out. People like Action Aid International, the Gambia, their role was to support technically and then financially, which they have fulfilled upon reasonable doubt. I must express that Action Aid have stood by the network and get us where we are when it comes to finance. Apart from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, they are the ones who are continuously funding the network and also working with the network to develop proposals to get funding from other donors. After putting all this together, because we have the commitment at the highest level, it was easy to mobilize these key players. These key players are called the care team in the provision of service under the one-stop center. They are called the care team. And the care team comprises of Edward Francis Small Teaching Hospital, where the one-stop center is, Kanifing General Hospital, and then you have FLAG, Female Lawyers Association, the Gambia, and then you have Shelter for Children, Bakote, you have Department of Social Welfare, you have the Police Gender and Child Welfare Unit, and the network. These are the people that constitute the care team. The reason why we say the care team, the victim or the survivor, we call it, will work with all these people one way or the other. The intention of the one-stop center is, as soon as a victim is at the one-stop center, which is the hospital, then there will be a telephone call, and all these other partners will be informed. So that is how the one-stop center are supposed to be operated. But unfortunately, not everything is the way we want it. Those are challenges that I will come later to explain.
So when did the one-stop centers, like when did they start functioning, essentially? You mentioned that there's one at Edward Francis Small, you mentioned Canifing as well, but when did these one-stop center start? Like when was the first one started?
2013. 2012, lately August, it started August 2012, but the actual work was in 2013. And by then we piloted at Edward Francis Small Teaching Hospital. And the piloting, the one-stop center actually brought about a lot of improving privacy at Edward Francis. Because when we went there to set up the one-stop center, the gynec ward at one-stop center, at the time, as many hospital wards, the table is in the middle of the ward, and that is where the doctor will sit, and that is where the client will come to explain what happened to the client. And often than known, sometimes clients will come with another issue. When they look around and see that this face is familiar, they will explain something else. That's what happened. So when the network went there to discuss this with the authorities at the hospital, we suggest whether we can have extra rooms. And the network was supported in that by the head of the Ops and Guide, Dr. Patrick, who worked with, and Dr. Bite. They worked with the Edward Francis heads, the senior management, until 3 rooms were provided very close to the gynec ward, just adjacent the gynec ward there. Those offices were used for other purposes, but they have to change. In fact, one of them was a senior doctor's office, but they moved that place. And then the network looked for funding from Action Aid, and they refurbished the entire area. And then we have a room where it is a reception, where when a survivor comes or victim, we'll sit there and we make sure that we have very good furniture so you can sit there, and we provide a television, a video where other things on sexual violence will be played, and then you will be looking at it. Like counseling that we are done for other people, you will be watching that while you relax there. And then there is an examination room where the client can go and be examined, and everything is done in a privacy. And then there is another room which is provided for the police and the social worker, so that when the client goes to those people also, they can provide services within the same room. So that is where we piloted. And the reason why we did that also is to minimize victimization. Because Dr. Patrick, whenever he's doing her training on sexual violence, he always brings this question. And we see how uncomfortable the trainees find it to answer. When he comes in, he will ask the question, is there anybody who would be willing to explain your last sexual encounter? As soon as he asks that question, people will be looking at each other. What is wrong with doctor? My sexual encounter. How can I explain that? They'll be looking at each other. They find it difficult. And here are people who they gave their consent, who want to do it, who derived maybe satisfaction from it, who is their legal partners, find it difficult to explain. Now this is somebody who doesn't want it to happen, who was forced, who undergo pain. You want that person to explain her order. You know that's difficult. So these are people who will go to the police. The police ask them. They explain everything. They move to the hospital. They ask them. They explain everything. They move to the... That is re-victimization. That is very difficult. So that is what we are trying to minimize by bringing everybody as she narrate. Let the police take whatever he or she want to do in terms of investigation. Let the social worker prepare whatever he or she want to do in terms of providing that counseling. Let the doctor take whatever he wants so that the person will narrate just once, not every time you start narrating what happened to you. So that was one of the ideas why we bring all of them together.
And in fact, that's very important because the more you get someone to tell such an ordeal, the more likely it is that eventually they might just stop telling it. Because it's frustrating. You mentioned Edward Francis Mall, you mentioned Canifing. Where else are these one-stop centers located currently?
Yeah, we have like Edward Francis, Canifing, Bansang Hospital. In fact, Bansang Hospital came before Canifing. And then we also, I know they are expanding to Essew, Birkama, West Coast Region, Soma, Farafenni. I'm not very sure, I think in Basse, but I'm not very sure, like I'm not in now. But I know they have done all the trainings in all these sites, and both for the police, for the social workers, for the doctors and nurses, they have done all the trainings. I'm not very sure whether they have provided them with the registers, whether they are collecting data yet, because normally when we do it, they do a little bit of capacity in terms of looking at the structure itself, what they need to put there. But I know they are expanding to all these places.
And you mentioned that the one-stop center is managed by a care team of different professionals. Do you have any kind of data coming from the care team in relation to sexual violence in the Gambia? Data that they've been collecting that would help us understand it much better.
Yes, the care team, they collect data. What the network did was we developed a register for uniformity, and the register will have the name of the survivor, the age, where the survivor lives, and it also have a place for the perpetrator, who is the alleged perpetrator, what is the alleged perpetrator's age, where does the alleged perpetrator live, did the survivor know the alleged perpetrator before, what is their relationship. All those are in the register to have a detailed whatever information from both the survivor and the perpetrator. These registers were developed, and each of the care team is provided with a register. And we also developed a reporting form that each of the care team have a reporting form. So like the Shelter for Children have a register, Department of Social Welfare have a register, Police Gender and Child Welfare Unit have a register, Edward Francis have a register, Serakunda General Hospital have their register, and the Bansang Hospital have their register. So all those that collect information, even FLAG have a register, because we don't only collect sexual violence, we collect different types of gender-based violence, physical, economical, psychological. We collect all of them. So all of them have their register. So this care team, any case that comes to them, they registered it into the register, all the detail, what happened, the management, and the one-stop centers like Edward Francis, they have computer. So they enter everything, they have computerized system. They put all the services that are provided, they prepare everything, especially if they are to go to court, they make sure that everything is provided, is recorded. So the care team meets every quarter. They meet at the network, And the network program manager will be part of that meeting. And then in that meeting, the reason why the care team meets is to verify the data. Verification is important because we have a very small country, and the network don't have a robust database that whereby if like Hadimbuj went to social welfare and my name and ID is entered, if Edward Francis want to enter it, it will reject it. We don't have that kind of database. So to avoid duplication and then raise the figures unnecessarily high, that is why the care team meets quarterly. That is one of the reasons. One of the reasons also they meet quarterly is to make sure that they discuss what happened to the case, what is the progress being made with the case, what are some of the challenges, and what they can do together. So when they have that quarterly meeting, each of them comes with their register. For example, if Edward Francis said, January 1st, Hadimbuj visited us, everybody will check whether that same Hadimbuj have visited you, so that it will be counted only once. If Edward Francis reported we have 10 sexual violence cases this month, Kanifi may report we have 30, the other one will report. But at the end of the day, when you put all these things together and verify what is the exact number, that is what the network takes and put into their database, and that is what they generate as the report. So that will really minimize duplication, if not totally elevating duplication. So that is what they do. And that data is what we normally provide to our donors, as these are the number of cases we have seen, and that is what we also provide for all the members of the network, because it's a membership-based organization. And this is what we also share at the steering committee meeting, because there is a steering committee which is chaired by the Women's Bureau, which also meets quarterly, where the network will go and share this data, and then discussion will be done on the data. So that's what we do with the data.
You've provided us with a copy of the data that was collected.
And I kindly refer to my data.
Indeed,
I'm not good at
please
figures.
do. I will also provide copies to the commissioners, and then you can just work us through the data itself.
This is extraction of only sexual violence, because we have, like I said, we have other gender-based violence like economic violence, psychological violence, we have physical violence, but I don't include those ones here. So the data I'm reading is excluding, is only sexual violence. There is no other types of violence included in this data. And I began with the 2014 data. 2014, the total sexual violence cases recorded is 92. And the number of adult victims, adult we all know is above the age of 18 years, is 23, which constitute 25% of the total data, and number of child victims, 69, and that is 75% of the sexual violence victims for 2014.
If we can just focus on that for starters. You mentioned number of adult victims and number of child victims. So I take it that the distinction here is between those who are under 18 and those who are over 18.
Exactly.
Can you tell us, for instance, how young is the youngest victim that you've come across generally throughout your work, and what kind of sexual violence that entailed?
The youngest was 18 months. The youngest
18 months.
18 months.
Can you give us an idea, of course without revealing any identifying information, what kind of sexual violence we're talking about for an 18-month-old baby?
Actually, when the 18-month child was taken for a medical examination, we learned from the doctors that semen was found on her. So they look at her, they said semen was found on the baby's private parts. So we will conclude that actual, if not penetration, but something around the vulva of the child has taken place as far as semen was found there. It's more than only molesting, whereby you may not find the semen there. So that is what we received, and this was actually within a family. These are first cousins, and the perpetrator, I cannot exactly remember his age, but it's in the 20s. Yes. So that is what happened there.
And we will really talk about that in more detail, the issue of culture and some of the misconceptions about sexual violence. From what I can see, in order not to go year by year, but from what I can see, when you began in 2014, you received some data and you recorded cases, but as time went on, and certainly with 2015, 2017, and 2018, you have huge increases in numbers. 2018, we're looking at 302 cases of sexual violence. Can you contextualize that for us, considering issues of underreporting? Like, what do those figures tell you in terms of what's really happening in Gambia surrounding sexual violence?
Actually, for me, I always say this is a research question. We need to ask ourselves, is the numbers actually increasing? Or does it mean that is the awareness raising that is paying dividend? People are gradually reporting? This is a question we need to ask, and I don't have the answers to these questions. And if I look at the other pattern also, like we have more children than more adults, is also a question that we want to ask. Why is it that most of the victims we are seeing are children? Does it mean that it is convenient to bring a child who is sexually violated than an adult? Or does it mean that because of cultural and other issues that we will discuss, that is why children are being brought? Or are we living in a pedophile society? Somebody needs to ask this research question.
What about in terms of adults? What's the oldest age that you've come across so far in your work?
If I can remember, it will be between 30 and 40, the adults that we have seen.
But you've mentioned the issue of underreporting in general, so that might not even reflect the reality of the situation.
Of course, yes.
So they're recorded as sexual violence cases, but do you recall what types of sexual violence were more common in your statistics?
I think the most common ones are rape and defilement. Those are the most common cases of sexual violence that are reported, rape and defilement.
But I assume that you also conduct, with your public sensitizations, that you have come across other types of sexual violence in Gambia, but they haven't been reported as much. What are some of those that you've come across, apart from rape and defilement?
Yeah, like during sensitization with the community, whereby the resource person will go in detail, telling the people that they are sensitizing the types of sexual violences that can occur. You will see that people are talking about molesting, which most of the people will say it happened, but maybe they don't consider it as a very serious issue. And the issues of sexual harassment.
Maybe just elaborate a bit about what you mean by molesting. Like, what kind of form does it take within Gambia from what you've seen?
I always say Gambians, we are very nice people, but I think some of us are very naive. That is the Gambian person. We give out our young children to anybody very comfortably, and sometimes even undressed. And some men will actually get their satisfaction by only playing with the organs, genital organs of those children, and that is molesting. They do that, and you will not even know. They can do that to a child over and over. that can happen. I didn't see a case, but I remember Department of Social Welfare in the care team meeting, we were informed that there was this man who normally, when the child cries, use his organ to put it in the child's mouth as a breast. So we are very comfortable to give out our children anyhow. But molesting takes place, whether it's a boy or a girl, in many forms with the child like that. And sometimes they are not reported. Sometimes they can even go in like up to the teens. They are doing that to them. They think it's normal. Because discussing sex and sexuality, you know, is a taboo. People don't talk about it to their children. They don't know what is good and what is bad.
And you mentioned the issue of the taboo when it comes to sex and sexuality. What are some of the words or what kind of language is used sometimes to describe certain things like rape? So what would people generally use in, let's say, Wolof, Mandinka, Fula to describe rape, but because it's a taboo, would use nicer language, essentially, to describe what is a sexual violence?
I know for the Wolof, they will say, "Def masako, def adanu kismoko." They want to make it very nice.
But when you hear that, for you immediately, that's an alarm bell for rape.
We know that the person is talking about rape. For the Mandinkas, aboitankan, nyapinkaun, ayelanyoya. So those are things we know. It's a red flag. For the Fulas, oyaniko dawa, we know it's a red flag.
And this kind of touches upon something you mentioned earlier, which is a lot of times people may not know what is happening to them, or a lot of times they just can't describe it because the language is not used often enough for people to describe what really happened to them. What are the cultural reasons that contribute to that?
We all know the culture of silence when it comes to sex and sexuality. And because this person is totally ignorant about her body, totally ignorant about her body. She doesn't know what she's carrying. She doesn't even know the names of her parts, generally. That's what happened. So they cannot even describe for you to understand. You have to be asking questions. And because we don't discuss it, the person even find it difficult to open his or her mouth to use that word. It's very difficult. And that this goes on. Even professional trainers, if you have to call a training and you are doing it in a local language, imagine it's very difficult as a trainer to start calling that, because that is how you have been socialized. You cannot call the parts. You keep on going around the bush for people to understand what you want to say. Among the trainers, very few people I can tell you who can boldly come and talk about those organs. That's not how we all are socialized. So people don't talk about it. That's the reality.
What about the issue of patriarchy within our society? What role does that play in terms of how sexual violence is manifested and how victims even understand sexual violence?
You know, patriarchy is everything that surrounds power, that surrounds position. And that is the society we live, patriarchy. It's about the power relation, power dynamic. Who has power over what? Who has power to? Those are the issues. So that power plays in different angles when it comes to sexual violence. For example, if somebody who has power over your welfare is a very strong person in your life and can make many decisions, especially if you are brought up in a place where you know, unfortunately, men are the perpetrators, and in our culture, in our homes, men are the head. If that person is talking to you, You give all the respect because the person is the one who is powerful at household level, at many institutions. They are very powerful. So if that person is talking to you of anything, you give that respect. You hardly say no. You find it difficult. It's not you are giving your consent. It's because you don't have choice. So that power dynamics. And they can change the story because people will listen to them than you. So that power dynamics plays a very critical role. The financial, economic power, the decision-making power, being the head, having that power, the influential power. They have all those powers. So power dynamics play a lot in sexual violence. Most of the time, the physical power, of course. Most of the time, people who inflict sexual violence on you, they are holding either both these powers or at least one of them before they can succeed. They must have that power to do that to you. Either they have the physical power, or they have the economic power, or they have the, even your emotion can be controlled by them. Because, for example, if they have everything around, they mislead you. They mislead you like telling you, you know what? This is what happened to every girl child before they grow up. So you have to accept this. They have play on your psyche because nobody informed you before. So it's
Can you
about
maybe
power.
elaborate on that a little bit? Because obviously children are particularly vulnerable, and from what we've seen from the statistics, a huge majority of the victims are children. So what does it, what are some of the ways in which children are influenced and in a way controlled because they're not in a position to understand what's happening? You started talking about how they can control you and make you believe that, this is normal. Are there some examples that you can give so that we can better understand what you mean?
Yeah, like we have received 2 girls. This is 8 and 10. And they were going to Dara. And these 2 young men, they were passing, they called them and asked them to come in. And normally children, they are easy, they buy things for them. They buy ice cream and things for them and tell them to wait. It's not yet time to go to the Dara that they are going to. And then eventually they asked them, can you please come in, undress? And the children said, they asked him why. They said, every child goes through this. Somebody have to teach you to do this. And that is how they raped the 2 girls. But when the 2 girls came back, they didn't explain it to their mom because they think it's normal. But their mom said, for one reason, anytime she wake up her children at night, she always look at their private part to see whether something is wrong. She said, upon doing that, she saw something. She said, this look like a semen or a discharge. Can these small children have discharge? And she wake up the elder one, which was around 10, and ask her the story. And then she decided to go around, not to explain it to her, because at the end of the day, they will tell you, if you explain to anybody, I'm going to do ABCD to you. But the younger one was brave and said, you know what? This so-and-so person on so-and-so road call us. And this is what they tell us, and this is what they have done to us. And that is how the mother went to the police station to report. Some of these cases, because the police work very closely with the network, sometimes they ask the parents, if the parents give their consent that they want to document this, they come and the network do a kind of a video documentary, because the issues are very fresh in the mind of the child and the mother, so that it's documented and kept very safely. You never know. Most of the sexual violence survivors report after several years. So if these children grow up, maybe one day they want to report that, they may even forget how everything happened. But maybe that video can be their support. So some of the few cases we record and keep them if they are willing. And when we are doing that, of course, their faces are covered, their voices are changed. The technicians know how to do that anyway. They do that. So this is a typical example that person, those young men have did to their children by fooling them that this happened to every child, which is not true.
So essentially, by not talking to children about these issues, they can be misinformed by other people and then place themselves in danger. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, by not even talking to children about their body. People should start talking to their children about their body. What are the sex organs? What are the sensitive parts that nobody should touch? If anybody want to go near that, what you should do? You should report. We should start telling our children, both boys and girls. That's what I'm saying.
You mentioned that sexual violence is really about power dynamics. How does that play in a society such as ours? I mean, every society does have this, where you have certain powerful people who may commit some form of sexual violence. How does society view those people? Or similarly, in a country like ours, which is so community-based and everyone is connected, how does that kind of closeness impact this issue of power within sexual violence and reporting or lack of reporting?
If sexual violence, somebody did sexual violence who is just an ordinary person, in fact, it's easy to discuss. But if this person is an influential person, is a powerful person, as soon as the victim opened her mouth and said, is so person, the reaction of even the parents will say, close your mouth, where do we go with this? Do you know how powerful that person is? Do you know calling his name what that will going to result to? How can you prove that? Those are the things that your immediate family will start telling you. And if, for one reason or the other, you mention that person's name, negotiation will go on. And that case will not even go from here to here, most of the time. I cannot remember in our work where an influential person is taken to court or whatever, I don't know. I cannot remember. It may happen, maybe I just forget.
What kind of negotiations are you talking about? What would be the exchange that would take place in such a situation?
If it is only about sexual violence and nothing happened, they'll say, let's keep quiet. You know, in the Gambia, the family name is more important than the victim. The family name is what they cover up. If you say this, you are spoiling our family name. How can we do that? How can we get you married? What about if people know that you are raped? You should keep quiet. You should be silent over this. We cannot talk about this. Even if they go to the health facility, they will tell them, we want, if there is any treatment, but we don't want this to go anywhere. We don't want our next neighbor to know that this happened to her. They don't want. If it is a sexual violence that happened, and sometimes the survivor keeps quiet and don't want to explain it to anybody, but unfortunately she becomes pregnant. And now they push hard that you are pregnant. Who pregnated you? And the person starts mentioning names, then that's the time the negotiation can come in different ways. They negotiate for marriage. If she delivered, will you marry her? Let's negotiate. If she delivers, you marry her, you name the child. If that fails, can we negotiate when she delivers, you are going to take care of your child? Those are the negotiations that takes place.
So essentially, for instance, with a rape victim who is then pregnant, this would be about marrying that person off to their rapist.
Yes.
Isn't that normalizing violence, essentially?
Of course, yes. You are normalizing it. Because you are telling the perpetrator that, yeah, this is okay for you to do. But you don't know what the victim is living. Because you have seen somebody who raped you. Every day you are seeing that person. The pain, the psychological pain that you are undergoing, without being explaining that to anybody. Because anyway, the people who are supposed to listen to you have compromised you to arrange for the marriage. Or say, okay, when she delivered, you're going to take care of the baby. And the person say, I cannot marry. but I can take care of the child. So they accept that. That's all. And if you have another husband, maybe what happened, the grandmothers will take care of that child. Maybe you will not even go to marry with that child with you. That child will be left behind for them to take care of that child.
Perhaps this is a good place to segue into the impact of sexual violence on victims. We have a few more minutes before the end of this session. Can you tell us what are some of the impact that you see for victims of sexual violence in Gambia?
Yeah, the impact comes in different ways. The impact on the victim herself, the impact on the family, particularly the mother, and then it can be psychological, it can be financial. Yes, the impact can take all that dimension. And we have seen impact that led us severe depression of the victim herself. So it takes a different dimension. And even the impact, it can have impact to the national budget itself. All the cases that are reporting to the hospital, the time that is being spent on that, the medications that are being spent on that could spend on other things if we don't have rapists around. So it has financial implication to the nation, to the community, the production. That person will not be able to function the way he's supposed to function at that time, especially when the person becomes pregnant, a child carrying a child. It has impact on the education of that child. For example, if the child is going to school, the child will go out of school for that particular period, even if the child is going back to school, which is allowed now. But sometimes they may not even go back to school again. So it has a lot of impact on them.
I mean, and we have heard cases where even if a child goes back to school, the reaction of, let's say, other schoolmates would actually lead them to drop out. So, for instance, either being stigmatized somehow because of rape or sexual violence.
Yeah, we have seen cases that are stigmatized, and they are victimized and isolated. We have seen a case that the entire family rejected the child. Entire family rejected her. And that child, particularly that particular girl, went through domestic violence abuse and later sexual violence, and later she was rejected. And she ended up having a very severe depression, completely going out of herself. And it was a very difficult case. We worked hard on her. We sent her back to school, but it was difficult. She has to come out of school again, and she's still not stable. So it has a lot of impact, totally disowned by the family.
You mentioned that sometimes this impact, it's particularly about the mother. What do you mean by that?
Yes, because the culture, if a girl child is not a good child, it's the mother. The mother is not a good mother. Oh, we expect this. You are not a good mother. So mothers cried inside. They have a lot of psychological pain when they see their child like this. In fact, I think that is why some of them, when rape happens, they don't even want the fathers to know, because the blame comes back to them. The victim is blamed, her mother is blamed for what happened to her. The perpetrator, nobody talk about him. That's what happens.
You mentioned the issue of victim blaming, and that's something that's common around the world. Can you perhaps explain that a little bit more for us to understand? What forms do victim blaming take, and what contributes to that victim blaming? Because the focus is on the victim, but never on the perpetrator who actually did the act.
In the Gambia, victim blaming comes in 2 or 3 forms. For example, if a young girl is being raped, she will be blamed maybe for her dress code. They will tell her that because he is not dressed properly, modestly. The way she dressed is not modest. That's what they would say. If the person dressed modestly, maybe nobody will rape her. But what is their definition of modest dressing? This differs from one person to another. That's what some people will say. Some people will say, why is she there in the first place? Why did she go to that particular place for this to happen to her? She will be blamed for that. She will be blamed that she is not cultured, like the way she has been brought up. And that she is not cultured will fall back on the mother as well. You didn't brought up your child properly. That is why she has been raped. So those are some of the things that they will blame the victim for what happened to her.
And in fact, from a lot of what you've said, anyone can be a victim of sexual violence.
Of course, yes. No matter who you are, anyone. Before you know it, you see people coming. I know the medical expert will tell you that we have seen very senior people coming to report, because anybody can be a victim. Sometimes you don't even know how you become a victim. You didn't even think about it. So sexual violence don't have a barrier. That's what people need to know. It can, and when you are looking at victims or survivors of sexual violence, you should never blame them. You should consider them being brave for speaking out, but not blaming them. Because it can happen to your sister, it can happen to your auntie, it can happen to your daughter. So nobody can guarantee that I'm not going to be sexually violated. It can happen to anyone.
Thank you very much for that explanation. I believe now would be a good time to take a break, and then we'll resume when we return. Madam Chair, I've concluded for now.
Thank you very much, Council. Thank you very much, Madam Hadi. We will take a break of half an hour and come back at midday. Thank you.